A shell sort of penetrated the ship, sort of should have penetrated the ship, but players were still displeased because the shell didn't do any damage.
I can tell a story about interacting with our Dutch colleagues.
This phrase alone makes all the participants of the production cycle flinch on the inside.
Our job is to create ships using references and make live in-game objects out of them.
We'll have to open up our skeleton-filled closet to prove this thesis.
Hi everyone. Today we're going to tell you how new ships arrive on the high seas of World of Warships, taking the example of our newly introduced branch of Italian destroyers.
We started researching references of Italian destroyers in 2017, when we were just getting ready to release the Italian nation. It was already then that our history and archive group specialists ordered references for the maximum number of ships that might be useful for us. We got references for Italian destroyers at the same time.
We took a look at the naval museums that exist in Italy. Unfortunately, no museum ships, destroyers, battleships or aircraft carriers in particular, of our historical period have been preserved. We made several requests for archives and found out an interesting thing. We could use the Ship Modelling Society from Bologna as a major source for blueprints. They have been cataloguing and cleaning up blueprints of Italian ships for many years. They have more detailed blueprints in a greater volume than the blueprints that can be found in various archives. They are doing brilliant and meticulous work. We want to thank this society for preserving Italian naval heritage. We sent a request to them and received all the necessary materials.
When we were preparing relevant references, our team also went on a trip to Italy, where our specialists visited local museums. Those were the Naval Technical Museum in La Spezia and the Museum of Naval Aviation in Vigna del Valle. The trip was rather short, but we brought photo references of the majority of museum exhibits home with us. Once we have all the necessary references, it's time to start planning. In 2020, we started planning the Italian branches, one of which was the branch of destroyers. The planning and discussion process is a pretty creative and interesting one, but always involves lively debates.
Usually our department shapes suggestions that are later discussed with the other development teams, such as the balance team, if they're interested in such a branch with some specific features, and signature warships.
Everybody comes to understand or remember the true meaning of the word compromise in real time. It's quite typical that everybody wants to follow their own interests in the discussions to come up with a solution. But mutual love of our game forces us to make peace with each other. We all recognise that the game is the most important thing here, so everybody has to adhere to the game requirements. We start by reviewing the candidates for every tier of a branch. The game designers present their ideas about what warships they would like to see at this or that tier.
Sometimes we have to replace one ship with another one because we lack the required resources, or vice versa, we have more resources about other warships.
Some kind of a showdown and debate start when we have two equal candidates in terms of the references we have for them. Some colleagues might want to see one ship in the game, and others want the other one. The most frequent compromise in such cases is that we add one ship to our branch and make the other ship a premium one. Is it a compromise? Basically, it is. With respect to the Italian destroyers, Tier 3 destroyer Sauro made her way to the branch, because we had references for that ship. Her opponent, Quintino Sella, didn't make it. No references, no vacant place in the branch? Sorry, Quintino seller. During these discussions, and there can be quite a lot of them, we also determine the armaments for each warship individually. If it's all clear with premium ships, they should be exactly the way they existed in reality, if they existed in reality. It's different with branch ships. We need to cast magic and carefully observe them to ensure the progression is balanced within a branch, even if we need to sacrifice some historical accuracy in the process. However, we still ensure that all ships are accurate from the technical and engineering perspective, and there are no violations in the time period as well. Let's talk about ship modelling, or to be more precise, Stage 0, designing the ships. Sometimes it turns out that a nation doesn't have ships for some tiers. Sometimes a nation can even lack an entire ship type. We have a special department that's involved in making references for artists, in case we don't have blueprints for a ship, or there is a paper ship in a branch. Our group of specialists with engineering degrees conducts research and calculations for future ships. The process is very serious. We conduct all calculations and design activities using specialized software. The Italian branch of destroyers couldn't have come to fruition without paper ships. These are Tier 8, Vittorio Cuniberti, and Tier 9, Adriatico. Tashkent and Mace Trail served as prototypes for them. Naturally, there should be some existing ship that a designer can be inspired by. During the inspiration process, our specialists remarked that they had experienced aesthetic rapture when they were exploring various ship hulls. The holes were streamlined and smooth. They demonstrated great hydrodynamics. Our designers tip their hats to the Italian shipbuilders. The style of their hulls is great. The design stage can take up to 6 weeks. The final stage is the validation of a project, and then it's passed to production as a reference pack. The development of a model takes from 4 to 6.5 months. The exact time depends on the ship type. For example, 4 months is enough to develop a destroyer model. 6.5 months is required for an aircraft carrier. It goes without saying that an experienced artist can do that task faster, but cases when a ship is complex and requires more time aren't rare. 2 artists can even work on one ship that requires coordinated work and a good mutual understanding. We should also mention that 30% of the working time is spent on searching for bugs, various checks and bug fixes.
We have a 3D model of a ship. Here she is in all of her beauty. We now need to determine the motion of the ship and her armour.
First of all, my job is to create setup files for a ship. It means that the source data I'm working with are a prepared historical reference and made models. At the same time, the game engine wants to know some things that can't be obtained from the historical reference. Like, for example, the action force of rudders while turning. Or let's say the speed of a ship while travelling along the circle of gyration. That's why this data isn't taken from the historical reference, but is calculated using a formula that comprises values for a ship's length, beam, type, etc. In addition to substituting historical data and using historical data as it is, we also do a lot of things that don't exist in a tabular format whatsoever, such as the angles of each individual gun.
When we were designing Paolo Emilio, we first restored the blueprint of the main caliber mount and planned to design the ship around it. It's standard practice for us. We do it this way all the time. We didn't have the complete blueprints for the 135mm main mount. However, we had a layout which, at first sight, looked quite precise and seemed to be correct. But it didn't have any dimensions indicated. Then we scale the blueprint using the dimensions we're 100% sure about. Thus, using the proportion method, we learn the true dimensions of the turret. Next, destroyer Attilio Regola, a real ship, sails onto the stage. The thing is that they have the same main mounts. While making the model of Attilio Regola, the artist took the already made model of the mount. The artist checked that the turret had been validated and was correct. The only nuance was that the turret model was made based on our own blueprints. It didn't match the blueprints of Attilio Regola. It can happen sometimes that the factory design documents of a ship are quite conventional. The art Q&A department is involved in the checking process, and while inspecting photos, an art QA specialist found out that the turret was 30 centimeters larger than it should be. The specialist then measured the turret's dimensions from photos using the proportion method and confirmed that the turret was too big. After that, we had to fix the turrets and two ships. If these bugs had been detected at the production stage, we would have had to remake the 3D models and textures, and this would have prolonged our production plan. It's good that we found the issue early on.
Next, we set up the cameras, their positions relative to guns and torpedo launchers, the way the free-look camera works, how far the camera can zoom out from a ship, etc. The thing is that the camera settings are applied for a ship and all of her skins just once. Thus, it's sometimes necessary to reset the cameras for a specific skin, then reset them again for the ship, for another skin for the ship. Sometimes it takes too much time, especially if a ship has several skins and all these skins have complex geometry, while you also need to fix the camera right between the superstructures, wires, lamps, and phew. After we obtain a somewhat working ship, we tune her motion in accordance with the desired ship's circle of gyration and set up armor thickness values. For ships to interact with various objects, they have different damage models. Ships have a splash model that allows them to interact with HE shell explosions. We've intentionally introduced visual hints for players about what ship parts it's most advisable to fire at. It's obvious that if you fire at a blackened section, which has already been destroyed, you won't damage it for a great deal of HP. This blackening is made around the cubes of the splash model. The splash model is made intentionally primitive, so there's no need to compute penetrations and proximity to a complex geometrical object. To interact with AP and HE shells, ships have armor models. We have armor layouts for ships in the game. There are standards regarding the thickness of ships' plating with respect to their tier and type. But there are also, for example, standards for separating different sections of a ship. Players rarely pay attention to that, but it greatly impacts survivability of a ship. For instance, French battleships have a poorly protected service space above the casemate and quite wide torpedo protection. As a result, shells can hit torpedo protection, deal zero damage, and travel farther to be part of a superstructure that has already been destroyed. So we have an outcome where a shell sort of penetrated the ship, sort of should have penetrated the ship, but players were still displeased because the shell didn't do any damage. The idea is that a ship's armor model shouldn't only correspond to the ship's lines and how the ship looks, but the armor model should also be closed. The way shells travel in a world of warships is quite a special mechanic which is highly demanding on the model which shells pass through. A ship's armor describes not only her armor but the borders of her sections as well. Therefore, if a shell penetrates the armor at the ship's fore end, then it penetrates citadel armor and explodes after that. The game logic will think that the shell exploded at the fore end and the citadel simultaneously. That's a forbidden case, which is why the bow end is a closed entity. At the place where the fore athwartship bulkhead of the citadel is located, there is also the zero traverse that concludes the fore end armor model. That's why the materials that belong to the fore end and stand in the way of an incoming shell have to meet an even number of times so the game logic can consider the shell to have left the fore end. It's a very important requirement, and validating this requirement takes a lot of work and resources. We need to validate that. First of all, the model is closed, it doesn't have gaps. Secondly, the model should be closed just once. For example, if someone copies and pastes a part of the armor model by accident, then a shell will pass through the same armor layer twice and it will think that it's already exited the hit location, when actually the shell only entered the hit location. That's why the armor model is a very complex entity, and its validation requires a lot of resources. It's actually a very important thing in the mechanics of World of Warships. Each ship has a collision model so that they can collide with other ships and islands, as well as be capable of computing their possible routes. These models are made totally different in order to simplify calculations. For instance, cruiser Minotaur is well known for how easily she can go down under enemy salvos. The reason is that the cruiser is unusually wide, and her torpedo protection isn't sufficient to stop an armor-piercing shell. As a result, the ship that corresponds to her historical reference and has the relevant armor thickness turned out to be highly vulnerable. And this almost defined the features of her entire branch. That's what happened to British cruisers. Because a shell arms and explodes at the citadel at any impact angle, and at any height relative to the ship's waterline, the cruiser goes down, and the entire branch gets their features. Italian destroyers got the majority of their features just because they're Italian ships. But some features were given to them during the initial setting process. For example, Italian destroyers have a relatively small number of tubes for their torpedo launchers. In this regard, their most likely rivals are French ships. As a result, the time they need to reload their launchers is relatively short. The same is true about French ships. During the initial setting, we also adjust the visibility of ships depending on their dimensions. Since Italian destroyers are quite large ships, they have greater visibility. This is offset with exhaust smoke generators, powerful engine boosts, semi-armor-piercing shells, decent shell damage, and the lack of armor-piercing shells. Ship armor plating thickness is critical to us. Starting at some specific gun caliber shells won't even consider bouncing off armor that's too thin. Let's say that 1mm thick armor won't be any obstacle for a 1-ton shell at any impact angle. Because of that, the armor of the destroyers mostly depends on the plating thickness and not on the real armor they carry. Frankly speaking, destroyers carry pretty minimal armor. At the same time, Italian ships are quite large, so they had better not stay under enemy fire for too long. In terms of their dimensions only, alternative German destroyers and Soviet artillery destroyers are close to the Italian destroyers, so it would be quite foolhardy to stay under enemy fire for a long time.
We've received new references. These words, this phrase, makes all participants of the production cycle flinch on the inside, because it means that something we've done based on our usual behavior patterns and standard way of thinking looks wrong. For example, we have a story about a lost wave cutter. A wave cutter is a structure at the fore end of a ship that pierces the waves and provides greater stability. There's a wave cutter on the blueprint, but it's not present in the photos. Finally, when we removed the wave cutter another time, one of our specialists found the confirmation that those photos of the ship had been taken during sea trials, when she was in an unfinished state. The wave cutter hadn't been installed by that point. Well, now the ship has a wave cutter installed. Let's hope the ship and her wave cutter will be fine eventually. There is a wonderful destroyer, Corto Torne. The caliber of her torpedo launchers is 450mm. At some point, we realized that we hadn't designed a torpedo for that ship. We had a ready-made torpedo. It was just an aviation torpedo. But we had gotten used to assuming that we already had all the required assets for a new branch when it wasn't the first branch of a nation. So we had to quickly make the torpedo. Thankfully, its design wasn't too complex. Now Corto Torne has her torpedo. Thus, we can conclude that the majority of our mistakes and complicated investigations happen when we become victims of our standard behavior patterns and when we work according to our specific scenarios. But World of Warships constantly brings us interesting tasks. We conduct investigations and find the truth, and we try to do so as quickly as possible. The icing on the cake of our production cycle is the production of various decorations. These are skins and camouflages. If we were talking about the Italian branch, the style of these ships is strict and modest. Our R&D specialists took their inspiration from historical camouflages. The decorations are pretty modest. We can say that Italian destroyers have their own unique style. That's how we do it. More realistic and modest decorations are followed by less realistic but more celebratory ones. By the way, the release of the Italian destroyers will affect the entire nation in the following way. The national features of Italian ships is the diagonal red and white stripes at their fore ends. This colour pattern was added to the real ships after Italian aviation accidentally attacked their own ships in 1940. It was introduced to ensure that the ships could be identified from the air. We liked that pattern, so we applied it. We were also careful to observe the time period so that ships of that specific period are painted in such a way. We decided that this was a very cool feature, and since we have some freedom of expression with respect to branch ships, we decided that all Italian destroyers would feature this red and white colour pattern. But then we decided that if the barn has burned down, so let the house burn too. We took the decision to add these stripes to all Italian ships, except for the premium ones, of course. So you can look forward to the update that will add red and white stripes to all Italian ships. I hope that all of our players find something positive and something they like in our branches and in our game on the whole. For instance, I like Destroyer Cortatone, because she rhymes with my name in quite a funny and inoffensive way.
Around 30 people from the art department alone worked on the Italian branch. The preparation took 2 years. Hundreds of gigabytes of historical references have been collected. It took 5 months to model each ship. It took 4 weeks to set up the ships. Then several playtests were conducted. And finally, the branch was introduced to the game. Full ahead, captains. Good luck in battle.